Hey there, welcome to the Soil and Roots podcast, journeying together into deep discipleship. I'm Brian Fisher, and this is episode 106, This Beautiful Mess, with my guest, Matt Davis. If you go back to season 3, it was all about the formation gap. Human hearts are best formed in healthy ways in certain specific environments that feature 5 things: time, habit, community, intimacy, and instruction. Yet most modern Christians don't have access to all 5 elements, and so our spiritual formation may become stunted or even stopped. And as much as we might not want to admit it, sometimes our beloved church institutions are actually one of the reasons that we're stuck. My friend Matt is a former megachurch pastor. As you'll hear in his story, he and his wife and family left years of ministering at a large church in LA for the much quieter life of central Kentucky, after an unfortunate decision ended Matt's executive pastor job. A few years later, he started a new effort with some friends, helping and serving other leaders and lay people who've been hurt and harmed by the institutional church, sometimes because of their own doing and sometimes not. So Matt's story and other similar stories raise some questions that we're going to wrestle with. Do the power structures that so often characterize modern churches help or hurt? Is the assumed role of the modern pastor what the Bible envisions for a pastor? How often is the institution valued over and above the needs of the individual? If we go to a church where we remain lost in the crowd, does that even contribute to discipleship? And in what ways may the formation gap be showing up, even in healthy church environments? Matt is a sound, careful thinker and a man who has suffered much in his life, but he's chosen to embrace that suffering and turn it into good. Also, one of the things I love about Matt is that he's pretty unfiltered. He's brutally honest about himself, his journey, the church, and how culture impacts our discipleship. We cover a whole lot of ground in this raw conversation, and I think you'll be blessed and challenged by Matt's story and his perspective. I certainly was. So thanks for watching or listening or reading as Matt and I dive into the formation gap and the helpful and harmful characteristics of Christian institutions, which are often beautiful messes. Everybody. So my guest today is Matt Davis, who I've just introduced, and I should just disclaim that he and I have known each other for, is it 2 years now? I guess it is.
Yeah, let's call it 2-year anniversary.
2-year anniversary, and we've only been in each other's presence a handful of times. So many relationships today are virtual, but as we were just joking before we pushed record, that when we get together, it's like not a whole lot of time has passed, because although we have very different stories, we seem to have similar perspectives on things, and I think it's going to be a great conversation. So, Matt, welcome to the show. Thanks for taking some time out today.
It's good to be here. Wish it was in person.
I do too. It's just not the world in which we live. You're all the way up in horse country. I mean, you went from LA to horse country. You got to give us some background on that story, because it's such a radical change. So why don't we start there? How did you go from, as you were joking before, LAX to LEX? How did that happen?
Yeah, well, we came here in 2018 for a vacation, the family. And to know my wife, Marilee, is to know that she loves horses. She's the little girl that had all of the horse figurines. And I've not ever been opposed to bourbon. And so Lexington, Kentucky was the spot for vacation. Additionally, she has a crazy uncle here in Frankfurt. And so there's a family vacation that was planned, and I thought this is a beautiful spot. We all fell in love with it, but I was knee deep or maybe neck deep in ministry life in Southern California, and thought, well, maybe one day when we retire, this would be a good place to go, but I'm never leaving my church job. And lo and behold, life changes, and here we are. Not quite the promised land of milk and honey, but it is the land flowing with horses and bourbon. And we're really happy here. We love it. We've been here. Say that we got our independence from California on the 4th of July, 2020. And that's when we moved out.
So good 4 years of living the country rural life, or more rural at least than Los Angeles for sure.
Yeah, we love it.
So you and I have had a lot of offline discussions about the institutional church, and today our topic is really what we at Soil and Roots call the formation gap, that human beings are created by God, and when we come into his kingdom, there's this ongoing lifelong formation process that involves time, habit, community, intimacy, and instruction. You are very familiar with Soil and Roots because you've helped us craft our messaging and communicate well with people, so we don't need to kind of go through those basics. But some of the work that I've been doing, and I know you've been doing, is assessing the modern church structures, institutions, and aligning that, or trying to align that with what genuine discipleship, spiritual formation truly is. And I've come away saying, man, we have some pretty wide gaps between what we experience in the institutional church and what Jesus was actually doing with his disciples in the first century. And I know you and I have had some riveting discussion on that. Today's conversation is really about how does that gap, that lack of certain things in the modern church, influence individuals? And you started an organization which is doing some fascinating work, attempting to, I guess, catch people on the back end once they've fallen into that gap, once they've been hurt or harmed, and trying to bring some restoration and fill in those pieces, which I find fascinating. It's sad that it's so necessary, because your phone never ceases to ring with people that have been hurt or harmed in institutional churches. At the same time, it's such redemptive work. So can you walk us through why you started Pastoral Transitions and what you do to kind of bring Jesus and genuine spiritual formation back to the lives of people who have been, frankly, broken by church structures?
That's pretty much the only question that you have to ask, because that really tells the whole story. That is everything. I served in the church for 22 years, and it was we called ourselves a mini megachurch in the heart of Orange County, California. And so we were not quite Saddleback or Mariners Church, with tens of thousands, but we had thousands, and there was a lot of people there. And I worked my way up from children's ministry intern to children's pastor to family pastor to our marriage fell apart once, and we got it back together. So they made me the marriage pastor. But I also, spent the last kind of chunk of my time there as an executive pastor and teaching pastor. So not only did I get to see how the sausage was made, I was making the sausage. I contributed to the thing that was the thing. And I had a moral failure that got me out. And that's the short version. The interesting thing is I had lots of moral failures before that moment, and I've had lots since, but there was one that really got me out, and I should have been out. And I totally agree with that decision. So no fighting or no, they were wrong in doing this. My wife was the loudest voice in that conversation saying, I think we're done. And not only, done with ministry, but our marriage was on the rocks for a bit. And thankfully, we're celebrating 23 years this year. And so we're there and we're thriving, we're doing well, and very thankful for all of that. But that left us in a no man's land where we fell apart. I fell apart. I fell apart because you move from community, you move from your face on two 20-foot screens that are flanking you on a Sunday morning to nothing. You move from being in Orange County with population of 3.3 million people, and you can't go anywhere without people knowing you, saying hi at restaurants and grocery stores, to how can I go to Trader Joe's in another town so I don't have to have that interaction with anybody. And so you go from community to isolation very, very quickly. And I think what a lot of people don't realize is that transition coming out of ministry is uniquely, it's not like you just lost a job and you just start knocking on another door, go to, monster.com or Indeed and just find the next job, especially when there's a moral failure attached to it. You also have to realize and wrestle with the I had a moral failure. I am not a moral failure. And, unpacking all of that stuff. And we just found out lately. So, being at a place for 22 years, you get to know people, right? It's life on life. And there's not, these are my business relationships and these are my personal relationships. You would work together all day and say, hey, what are we doing tonight? And that life on life was beautiful until it's not. And even though we all said like we want to do a good job in the transition, we just all realized it was incredibly hard and it didn't go how any of us planned.
Mm-hmm.
And so that brought up this, what do we do? What are we going to do as a family? The church does a good job at recovery, right? Like, all right, set up the search committee. Let's figure out how we're going to make sure that this next season is thriving for the church. And there's going to be backroom conversations with that guy who is going, and we'll figure that out. But how we've likened this is that the entrance or the on-ramp for bringing people into a ministry position. And when I say ministry, I'm talking my situation uniquely is in the church, whereas I know that, there are people who go through this in a nonprofit setting. Missions agencies are particularly not great at this. We've talked to people in Christian higher education and even Christian businesses that just want to do this better. But the on-ramp is beautiful, right? It feels prayerful. It feels elder run. There's this candidating, get to know you process. But when the decision's finally been made, I liken it to installing or coronating the coronation of a king in the castle. And once that decision is made, the drawbridge comes down, the flags are furled, the little girls are wearing their best dresses, and the birds seem to be singing songs, right? It's that scene in Tangled that's the picture that I think of. And all the people are lined up, and the person comes down with their family, and they come up, and the whole group is there. The whole kingdom is there. And it's almost as if we take the sword and we say, I now dub thee pastor. It's prayerful. It's beautiful. And honestly, it's God honoring. It's a great moment. But the off ramp is far different. It doesn't feel, and I know that elders and leadership, it's prayerful for sure, but it feels a little bit more legal, and it feels a little bit more HR, and it feels a little bit more like, don't let the drawbridge hit you on the way out. And that scene of the kingdom will go on, and it certainly will. I think the kingdom of God is an unstoppable force. Whether we try to stop it or not is not the case. But because of my own unique experience, I got very interested in, once we kind of recovered and found our feet again, that picture, that scene, if you could almost zoom up from that like kind of drone aerial perspective of the kingdom's still going, and what happens to that family that's now walking away? Where did they go? Did anyone meet them along the way? That started to become a great concern. But, for us, for a long time, we struggled.
It seems like part of the challenge is that the on-ramp is so beautiful because it's exciting and new, and we tend to treat our pastors as rulers versus servants, at least in this part of the world. But when the off-ramp happens, whether it's because of some failure on behalf of the pastor or some structural change on behalf of the institution, the grace disappears. Like you said, once the attorneys get involved, forget the grace is going to evaporate very quickly, because you have to protect the institution. You move from honoring the individual, but as soon as the individual no longer is the institution is now prioritized. This is one of my major beefs with the corporatization of the American church. Because, Pastor so-and-so is now an embarrassment to the image of the church or the senior pastor or the institution. And so we're basically going to ship him and his family off as fast as possible and pretend like it never happened. It just happened to a megachurch here in the area. Pastor on a huge church staff, something happened, just disappears. An email goes out. An email basically says, hey, don't talk about it. Like, don't spread rumors, don't gossip. But that did not go over well with the congregation or the press, by the way, because it seemed like a control mechanism. But if your point is to protect the institution, you begin to make decisions like that. So am I reading that right? Whether the transition is warranted or not, it seems like immediately the institution becomes the priority. And I don't mean the church universal. I mean the church of so-and-so, St. Peter's, First Assembly, whatever. That becomes the be-all, end-all instead of the needs of the individual. Are you with me, or am I off base on that?
Yeah, I'm with you, and I understand. But I'd be curious, and this is your show, and you get to ask the questions. But I'm curious for you: is it that we're trying to protect the church to the detriment of the person that it feels like the person that's leaving has no protection? Like, what if we actually protected both in this dynamic? Or is it that we're clamping down and what once felt like a transparent, open process? Like we work with some groups and we talk about culture. What's the culture you're trying to develop? And before you have a major transition, it's, hey, open door policy, and we want to hear what you have to say, and knock on anyone's door. We love this is a loving, great. I mean, there's an organization called Best Christian Workplaces that has a survey they send out to the, you can sign your church up so you can have the best, and if you score high enough, then you get this
you get
stamp
the label,
on your website.
you get the star,
right.
Yeah.
Yes, here's your badge, right? So that, and which is great. Of all places on earth, I think the kingdom, if you work at a kingdom place, it should be great. It should be like, if we're following the rules of the kingdom, then yes, I totally agree. But we have certainly systematized that. But where for you, because I sense the same passion that's come up in earlier conversations, is it that we're protecting the church? Because I think the church should be protected, or is it that we're not protecting the individual?
I'm not sure they should be distinct. That's my concern. So Tim Keller, who was a famous pastor in New York City of a megachurch, multiple campuses, said, I think in any major city, it's good to have churches of all sizes. We should have home church networks. We should have small churches, mid-sized churches, and we do need a few megachurches because of the resources and the work that they're able to do. I've come to the conclusion I disagree. I don't know why. I'm not sure we should have megachurches. I think megachurches can actually be deeply harmful and destructive to the kingdom and to the body of Christ, because I'm not sure how genuine spiritual formation is supposed to happen if you've never met your pastor. Meaning, I've run into lots of Christians who say, oh, I love my pastor. Oh, have you ever met him? Oh, no, but his sermons are amazing. Well, how do you love somebody you've never met? How can he possibly be your pastor if he doesn't know your story and your situation? So to your question, as a return volley, I guess, if the institution is responsible for discipling its people, then even when its people make mistakes, how is it discipling those people? Are they being discipled even as they exit, or even as they recover, or even as they're restored? Well, if you're going to put the institution first, that discipleship goes out the window. And I genuinely don't understand how a megachurch claims that it can possibly pull that off, whether or not it's for somebody that's transitioning or, frankly, somebody that's just sitting in church. So I'm wrestling with this not only on the backside when something unfortunate happens and there's a separation, but just in general. If you're sitting in a church with 10,000 people and you hear a good sermon and the worship music's great, are you formed more like Jesus through that? How is that possibly happening if nobody knows you? It doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah, so institutional trust, even outside the church, right? Just government institutions, any institution is just really in the tank. And if only we could separate ourselves and say, well, that's the world and we're the church. But, unfortunately, the church has found its way into headlines that now that institutional trust is, whether that's, Catholic priests, church scandals, abuse, sex abuse scandals. We have leaders that are messing up left and right. In the last couple months, I've worked with churches that have pastors who are now in jail for stuff like assault. And, so that institutional trust goes down. And I think that the thing that lends itself to that lack of trust is that we we go quiet and we don't talk about certain things. And I do think that there is something about confession that frees us up, right? There is something about this, like we got to be able to say this is what happened and be honest and be disappointed and feel the grief, but we are trying to protect this thing. And it can, like, I totally agree with you that in a large church setting, the meeting is happening every Monday of what came in on Sunday. And are we going to be able to keep the lights on? And that's an unfortunate conversation. And so if you have an argument for that, like, yes, we've created these things that have to be now sustained. I have no problem employing people in a church to do a job, but what it's also created, it's not I don't have a, like, my ministry experience and what we were doing, like, has not given me any kind of crystal clear, like, okay, well, we should not, like, obviously, if I was a nurse and all I saw were sick people, I'd say, like, everybody's sick. And I don't think that that's the case, although I'm seeing a lot of that. But I do think that we've hurt ourselves with the paid professionals piece, right? That because what it's done is it's made lazy parishioners, lazy people who are going to church saying, well, that's their job. I don't have as much of an issue of, I love my pastor, even though I've never met him or shaken his hand. I've seen some pastors, like, they kind of roll in a few minutes before in, a Cadillac, and they go into the green room and come out on stage just before they go on, and they leave before anybody, right? So that I don't know if that's a pastor. I think that's a teacher or a figurehead. And right. I think that, essentially they're a CEO of an organization that's there for the fundraising purposes, right? Like, that's why we have key man policies, insurance policies. If that guy goes down, then we have to make sure that we can keep the ship afloat financially, which is a really, spend some time thinking about that. It's a painful, like, I don't like thinking about that. So we'll move on. But there is this piece that if we're actually going to have a large church, this is a place to belong, then we also have to be very intentional about building a place to be known, right? Belonging is this large group identity. I am part of this community, and that puts me part of this larger community that is the Christian community, the believing community, followers of Jesus. But if that large church has not set up something where we can experience small group formation, we're missing it. And I think that the people who are leading those small groups, those are your pastors. We just don't tell them that. We just say you're a small group leader. But I think biblically, like, you don't see the word small group leader in Ephesians 4. Those are people who are teachers and they're pastoring you. So I think some of that is just, how do we look at that? But we're very scared to kind of deputize anybody on the volunteer side of things, because we've made so much out of the paid professional that pulls off the Sunday show.
Yeah, and I think I had dinner, this is, 10 years ago, with a Christian leader of a massive parachurch organization who vowed that if I ever named him, he'd disown me, so I won't name him. But back in the 80s and 90s was kind of a household name. And I said to him, look, for all of the work you've done in the States and around the world on the topic that he was focused on, how many local churches ever absorbed what you were teaching and made changes inside the way that they conducted their ministry for the betterment of their congregation? And he said 0. I said, wait, what? You've been doing this for like 20, 30 years. There's not a single congregation that has adopted what you've taught and have tried to persuade folks for the kingdom? And he's like, no. And I said, well, why? And he said, because every pastor is a CEO. They are paid to generate dollars to sustain their institutions. And so introducing change or volatility or risk is a threat to their income and a threat to the income of other people on staff, but primarily a threat to the image of the local institution. Now, I found that to be shocking at the time and somewhat disheartening, but it seems to align with some of what you're saying, which means we have to look at the role of them. I have no problem with pastors or church leaders or nonprofit people getting paid. I think they should be paid extremely well because of the work that they're doing. At the same time, we seem to be ignoring the issues that raises. I mean, you get calls every day, every week from leaders and church members who have been harmed by the institutions. I'm assuming that those stories, much of the time, include tensions caused by the fact that they're part of an institution that places the institutional priorities above the individual. Is that correct, or is that not correct?
No, in some cases, for sure. In some cases, a lot of cases, there's burnout. Like, I'm done. We talked to a pastor a couple of weeks ago who said, I just want you to know, like, I'm looking for a way out. I need to get out. And I said, like, what's going on? Was there, like, some kind of scandal? Is there, like, what's happening? And he said, no, everything's actually fine. Like, the church is growing, never been better. He said, but my success is killing me. And he just said, like, I'm burned out. The expectation to hit a number one hit every Sunday morning. We are not easy to please people in the church. And I can't imagine, the guy's speaking 48 times a year, or even 40 times a year, to like have to come up with all of that. But yeah, we are attached. And I know, like, I know a church that, had a $4.1 million campaign so that they could put a new roof on the building. Which, the question in that brainstorm is, how do we make this more sexy? And I don't know how you do that. They want to actually kind of squeeze some ministry stuff in there too, but we need new HVAC and roof, and this is not real great, but the temple needs it. So how do we do that? So we are attached to keeping the machine going. There's families that depend on it because there's families that are, on staff, and we try to make this happen organizationally. So I get that. But I'll tell you, on the other side of that conversation, I have this ministry. I also have another ministry that just has a monthly gathering locally. I don't care who shows up or how many show up. We don't take an offering. They can go to the website and they can give if they want, and that's just going to support operations. And we get to be conduits and not buckets, and we get to just send that money out. So I get to show up, and it's once a month. So I'm not like stressing over what I'm going to talk about. The Lord gives me plenty over the course of a month, and like that freedom. But people are coming up to, I do this ministry with my dad, but they come up to me and my dad, and they'll say, hey, this is great. We love this. Like, when are you guys going to start a church? And I look at them and say, why would I ever mess this beautiful thing up that we've got going now? Like, no, we are not going to start a church. This is it. We are so happy with just gathering and coming together and doing this differently. And so that's, but it's hard to, I wouldn't have said that 10 years ago. I want to build and have impact, and you could do some great things. I mean, you're a brave man to disagree with Tim Keller. But there are some great things that you can do. The power of, leveraging American dollars to be able to send overseas to build the kingdom. Like, man, some of that's really inspiring. It's great. But what is it doing to us and our souls? And does that bleed into a little bit of the lack of trust in the institution of the church? Are you saying this because you need to make sure, like, hey, we have to make sure, like, we talk about the offering once a month, right? Like, so it might just be the financial motivation that maybe, I don't know if that's the thing that it irks you, but there is this thing that we have to keep it going.
Well, I'm pretty open when it comes to topics of money. I mean, I think money, like anything else, is a tool that can be used for the kingdom. I think there's multiple challenges with the institutionalism beyond the financial. You mentioned one. You have this friend who's burnt out because he has to put on a good show every Sunday morning. This, to me, is so ironic that the Sunday morning sermon, at least in the Protestant church, is the de facto thing. Yet I've yet to hear a pastor who hasn't joked from the pulpit that nobody remembers their sermons. So we
I don't
put,
remember my sermons, right?
I
Like
don't,
people would go up to, they say like, "Oh, I love that thing you said." I'm all, "Oh, I said that?" Like I had no clue. I just gone, right?
I can imagine him being burnt out when he is putting so much time and effort into a 30-minute monologue, which he knows is going to be forgotten and only a tiny minority of people are going to be influenced by. I've yet to meet a pastor who doesn't see the Sunday morning sermon that way. And yet, that is supposedly the primary way that we evaluate the character of our leaders. It's stunning to me because we don't place that same sort of importance on a monologue. I'm not sure we do it in any other sort of career. I mean, you and I have a mutual friend who's just been through a church implosion. And as we've watched him go through that, you have a narcissistic pastor, screws some things up, circles the wagons, ousts people from the church who don't agree with them, refuses to be I mean, this is a tale that's told over and over again, but supposedly he's fairly witty on Sunday morning, and so the church gives him a pass. I sit back, as our friend has sat back and said, wait a second. Aren't we supposed to evaluate church leadership based on character? Like, aren't those the lists, the primary lists given in by Paul in at least 2 different books? So for your friend who is appropriately burnt out, because I'm wondering if underneath the surface he's saying, I'm being held accountable for something which I know is not particularly disciple making anyway, that would burn anybody out. Is that a factor? Is the perception of what a pastor or church leader is, in addition to the financial pressures, part of what's causing the relational carnage that you see every day in your ministry?
Sure. And Barna has the statistic that 42% of pastors are seriously thinking about quitting their ministry.
Wow.
And I remember even being in my ministry at times, mostly on Sunday afternoon after I flopped with something, but you would see somebody else, you'd see another friend who said, I love the church. I need to go do something else. And I think, oh, he got out. He got out. There's like almost a relief, like, okay. And I know some people, like I would think that a lot of people are look at pastors like, are you really getting that stressed out over like one morning a week? Like pull it together. Like I have a job that's, 60 hours a week, 5 or 6 days a week. But there's an expectation and there is a 24-hour-ness to that we look at and there's just a burnout, and that expectation, the life under the microscope, the life on the 20-foot screens, I think it weighs heavy. And there is not a separation of this is my life, my real life, my everyday life, and this is ministry. And I think that's what leads us to wanting to get out. You don't see a lot of people. I talked to a black pastor in Georgia early in the year, and he just said, he was in his 60s. He said, I am the only African-American pastor that I know who's actually retiring from my position. He said, every other black pastor that I know has either died in the pulpit or failed out in some way. I thought,
My gosh.
wow, isn't that crazy?
So what's the solution? You've seen more of this than most people. You've lived it, and now you're serving and ministering to leaders who have gone through it. I mean, as you survey the landscape, and you and your dad are having this monthly process, which sounds far more formative and healthy than what many institutional churches promote or provide. Like, where do we go from here?
Yeah, you'd think I'd have a better answer. I mean, I like a lot of what you're talking about with soil and roots, right? Like there has to be an organic and not synthetic answer to this, that like we are trying to grow this thing under the guise of bringing the kingdom, getting the gospel out, evangelism. And I say guys, and maybe that's too skeptical. I think that there's people who are truly driven by that. And then there's some people that really just want to be successful personally. And I think that in the pulpit, there's a lot of ambition and there's a lot of insecurity. I see both. And both of those cause me to have compassion on the people who are on stage. I think that those two play against each other constantly. see a lot of insecurity in the pulpit. And I think if we could do something to tone down the pressure, to release the pressure, that I think that there is this place, and I think that what you're trying to do with the greenhouse is in trying to help this be a place. What would it look like for pastors to be able to have these safe places, these communities, but also that we're not dictating like, hey, this is all about you. Like, this is, you've got to make this happen, right? Like, I was approached at one point to be a senior pastor, and it was kind of the same thing of like, I'm so happy as an executive pastor. Why would I ever be a senior pastor and ruin all of this love that I have, right? Like, I don't want to wear the target. But I remember somebody telling me, they said, Matt, we think you're the 5-tool player. Which is, the baseball reference of, the person that can hit and field, like Gold Glover, they got the speed, you can do it all. And that expectation that we have to live into, and that's the person that we're looking for. The job descriptions that we see of, you are going to be everything for this organization, and our vision statements that we are going to be everything for the world. Oftentimes I think what we have to do is we have to look at people and we have to say, show me your wrists, right? Like, put your wrists out. I thought I was talking to the resurrected Messiah. Like, that, if we could actually get ourselves off of that mentality that I don't have the power to save the world, I can bring them to the one that can. And I think that that's going to be a much more, but I'm even thinking as I'm talking, like, well, what did Jesus do with the crowds? Like, Jesus didn't always push away the crowds. Like, he welcomed crowds, right? By the thousands. There were moments where Jesus had a megachurch gathering, but he also had that place where people could be known. And what does that look like? So
I was in a conversation a couple weeks ago with a pastor from the South, and this is a gentleman who had done the megachurch thing and all different sorts of institutional arrangements. And he said, I've come to the conclusion that discipleship can't happen in groups of more than 12. Meaning not sermons, not listening to good messages, but discipleship, knowing and being known for the purpose of becoming more like Jesus. Character formation cannot happen in groups larger than 12, which shatters the conception of the modern church, right? Because I realize we have small group ministries, but I'm not the only one who looks at that and says, I'm not sure those intended to have successfully done what they were intended to do. They were sort of the modern replacement for Sunday school. Sunday school itself had some challenges, like even in those environments, is sitting there listening to Bible teaching and learning more about the Bible, which is good, and learning more about Jesus, which is good. That may or may not be formative, unless you're a part of a group where you are comfortable and safe to divulge your soul, to confess your sins, to share your story, to understand how character is actually formed. The intellectual pursuits are only going to take you so far. And I think that's one of my, we've mentioned finances, we've mentioned the role of the pastor, which tends to be more of ruler versus servant in many modern contexts. You also have this expectation of, oh, if I just go to church and I have a worshipful experience and I learn something new about the Bible, that means I'm being formed. Whereas character formation has to be two-way and it has to be vulnerable. Do you agree? Because to me, it was a fairly radical statement. Discipleship cannot happen. He said discipleship has to be in community, and it can't be in community larger than 12. I'd just love to hear your take on that.
Yeah, I think there's something to that. I think that, you can only go around a circle for so long. And if that circle has 30 people in it, that's going to be hard to get to know one another. You're going to have to do that in stages, right? Safety changes. There's a lot that cannot be done. And so maybe there has to be a redefinition of, well, what does discipleship look like? And then what is the point of the big gathering, the rallying point, right? Where we come together. And maybe that is the Sunday morning. And I know churches are like banging their heads against the wall to start a small group ministry, right? Like they really are. They're trying. And if we can find the best curriculum or right now media that's going to help us to like kind of facilitate those conversations. Yeah. But I think I agree with that. Like, I think that there has to be a life on life gathering point where we know each other, and I know where your propensities are, and I'm creating space for you to be able to give an account for how you're living your life as a father, or as a spouse. And this is the place where we grow. We can bring our struggles, and we can confess to one another. This is where I'm at. And I see that, like, and this has become a theme for me. Like I told you earlier in the year that I started something crazy. I joined a group called Men and Women of Discomfort, um, which is, my friend Dane started this group where it's really about fighting this epidemic of comfort. But we're put in pods, small groups, and those pods are, it's interesting because that's the place where you check in. We have to check in, and the discomfort is, I'm only eating certain things, I'm working out, I'm sleeping, I'm drinking enough water, I'm not having my phone in bed. But every single morning, every single night, I'm checking in with my pod. And so it's a 90-day stint. I'm on my third round of that. And round number 2, I was in a pod of 22 people. And I found that I just didn't have the time to like listen to everybody else's check-ins. I didn't get to know the people. And this round I'm in a pod of 10, and I feel so much more connected. But it's interesting. He's a believer. And so he sets certain things up. Like he calls it Friday Fess Up. And we just say, here's where I fell short this week, and here's my plan for getting back on course. I've made a commitment to this, and this is how I want to live. And it's secular and Christian people in there, but like I'm just to see confession out in the wild. It's so beautiful, like to see what that looks like in my pod of people who are, they're not going to church on Sunday. A couple of them are, but they're practicing confession and getting to see the fruit of that in this pod. And so what's crazy, and maybe you need to talk to him because that would be a really cool and interesting conversation, is I'm seeing discipleship lived out life on life in this pod, probably even better than I've seen it in the church context.
Well, I think that leads to the question: have you found small, intimate communities to help you become more like Jesus than a million church services? Is that even a fair question?
Yeah. Coming out of such a large community, and then moving to central Kentucky of all places, during the pandemic, even, we were not going to church for a bit. Part of that season for us was healing. And part of it was nobody was meeting. So, we were watching The Chosen on Sunday mornings as a family on the couch. And that was good. We still love Jesus. But, which is even funny that I have to qualify that. But my wife and I have felt like coming out of what we've come out of, that community for us was, we needed a little bit of a break. We didn't want to re-enter too quickly into anything. And then I think probably about a year ago, we started to feel a little bit more of a loneliness and a desire for community. And so we're just trying to pay attention to that still. I don't know if we have a small group established, but I have a couple of good friendships that I check in with. I would say those are the people that are asking me questions and hanging out and searching my soul. And, but that only, I get out of it what I put into it. And you have to be intentional rather than just saying, we're just going to do coffee.
Yeah.
And hang out. And what was your week looking like? So, all of that needs a level of attention and intention. But yeah, I think it's absolutely necessary. And we want that, we desire that, but I think we've also needed a little bit of a break.
No, I think that's entirely fair and healthy. The danger of having a conversation like this and then throwing it out into the public is that, people who legitimately, genuinely, passionately love their local church, and they should, are saying, hey, my pastor works hard. He's an amazing shepherd. Maybe I don't know him all that well, but he seems like a great guy. He delivers the word on Sunday mornings. I'm being fed. I'm not suggesting tossing the baby out with the bathwater. What I am saying is, if we're going to be brutally honest with ourselves, I've yet to encounter someone who has said attending a weekend event over the long term has been the most formative thing in my life. It's almost 100% of the time relational, and relational in small sort of communities. And I'm not talking about a Bible study, and I'm not talking about the traditional small group. I think I'm alluding to more of what you just experienced and what you're expressing in the pods, what you call life on life. What I'm wrestling with, Matt, is the implications of that. If there are many good things about the traditions, and I think the modern church is largely now based on traditions, and many of which are still good. The monologue sermon, hymns, worship choruses, service opportunities, maybe evangelism, all good. But if we're conceding that those rituals are still woefully incomplete as a means of becoming more like Jesus, that becoming more like Jesus requires deep, intimate, long-term relationships that help us, form us to be more like him. What do we do with that? To me, it seems like we're now really wrestling with the institutional power structure. But I could very well be wrong. Have you seen a large church or even a mid-sized church say, hey, look, we're basically, Willard said, genuine discipleship looks more like AA than it looks like the modern church. Have you seen a modern church that has AA types of groups in it, not just for those struggling with addiction, but for everybody, giving that much authority, power, and influence to the lay people for the purpose of spiritual formation?
Yeah. If you're looking for perfect, you're not going to find it.
Right.
I'm not exactly sure how, Jesus is going to take every tribe, tongue, and nation at that point. And then I don't know what discipleship looks like, right? We'll be in his presence and everything will be healed. And so we don't have that issue. But no, I think there are certainly churches that have phenomenal groups where this is happening. And then they see that, and that group starts to grow. They add more people to the group, or that group says, we're going to take what we've got and we splinter it off. And then it doesn't necessarily multiply how everybody wanted to. I think there are groups within the institutions that are doing a phenomenal job, like no doubt. But I think that takes an ability for leaders to be able to create that environment, to be able to make that happen. I will tell you, this is probably outside the lens and the scope, but my guess is, based on conversations I've had with friends internationally, that the small group movement that takes place in the underground church, I think what needs to happen for the church, the Western church, the American church, the North American church, is if we could throw a little bit of persecution into that I think we would all get a lot more serious about our trust and dependence on Jesus. I mean, if we're trying to figure out what the formula is, the framework of how do we put these, yes, like there's certainly aspects of things that we want to do, right? There's community, and how do we put these things in? We need to have time, and there has to be habits. Those things, when you apply, I have a friend who used to say, that people don't see the light until they feel the heat. I think that we would get far more serious about our relationship with Jesus, and it won't need to be so structured when that persecution comes. And I just think that we've got it easy.
Yeah, I hear you. I have mixed emotions about that. And I should, jokingly, we should let your audience know that you're Jewish, so suffering is sort of in your blood anyway. I mean, you sort of expect persecution as part of the deal, right?
I was going to take it there at some point.
I knew you were. I preempted you. I agree. At the same time, I would broaden it, saying I'm not sure it's just persecution, because persecution can snuff out as much as it can grow. Suffering of any sort of nature, trial, I think, is extremely formative. I mean, discipleship by necessity, right? When trials and struggles come, and you and your family have certainly been through them, you either go with Jesus or you don't. You're either going to dive deeper into your relationship with him, or you're going to say, screw it, I'm done with you. You've let me down. I'm out. deconstruct,
Totally.
right? And we've seen that all over the place. I know you have friends that have deconstructed, as have I. It seems to be incumbent in true discipleship, because to become closer to Jesus means that we live more and more of his life. Have you found that to be the case? Or as you look back, would you say, man, I really wish we had had a different sense of community during those years?
We call it the Uriah effect. And it's that sense of we're all on the front lines getting ready to, we're enlisted, we're in the battle, and the commander says charge, and you're Uriah, and you run out into the middle of the field, and you turn around, and all of your buddies are still back there on the front line, and you're like, what just happened? And before you can really have that moment to figure out what is going on, the arrows are coming from the enemy, and it feels like the arrows are also coming from friendly fire, and you're caught in no man's land, and you're trying to make sense of what's going on, like this isolation of. And I think in my situation, like I have to wrestle with like I wasn't just abandoned. I did something, right? Like I dropped this bomb on a community that, exploded. So, I can't, we just don't do very well with sin. We don't do very well with suffering. What's also fascinating and part of our process, I have to say, like the intention of the board at the church that I was at, in some places, I think it is toxic leadership, and there's just people who are mean. And I've heard too many stories to like believe otherwise. But I can say that in my situation, I was at a church that this was not the first time that there was a moral failure on a large scale.
Sure.
Impacted, but they said we want to do it differently, and they really wanted this to be a healing experience. And so part of that meant that they wanted us to still attend the church. And that felt impossible. Like we had to gather, we did have community. We were not totally abandoned. There were people some people are just able to move towards suffering and be with you. Right. And so we did have those people, and those people met us 5 minutes before service in the parking lot. We probably had 6 weeks off before we attempted to go back again. Let some of the nuclear reaction kind of become tolerable again. And we met them in the parking lot, and they basically formed a Roman phalanx around us and got us into church, into the back row. And then as, they're praying at the very end of service, we got up and they got us out. But one time we got out a little too late. And I remember a guy, this is about 2 months into that whole process, a guy comes up to me from the church and he says, "Pastor, I don't know what you've done, but I'm sure as hell glad that the elders don't know what I've done, because they would have kicked me out a long time ago." Mm-hmm. And I thought, whoa, they can see what's going on. The people are watching. And I think how we treat one another in these seasons, it's going to push people into protection where I have to go hide. I don't want my sin to be found out. And in a large church, you can do that, right? I think that's why a lot of people do go to a large church or for the children's ministry. So they either go into protection or they go into performance. I'm going to make sure that I'm pulling it all off. And I think that those two directions are not good for our formation because they're not real. But I realized, like in that situation, that so I like on one side of things, like the board that was governing over the situation, they did legitimately try to do the right thing. I think they legitimately cared about myself and my family. I just don't think it was the right way to do things. I think in the end, it was really impossibly hard for us.
Well, let me wrap up. Let me try to summarize what we discussed and then ask one more question. Then we'll wrap up the conversation. We've talked about the institutional church, both its positives and its drawbacks. So the positives are good teaching, corporate worship, obviously, many service opportunities. Some of the negatives are the role of the modern pastor is questionable. And there's financial considerations that oftentimes sort of gets in the way. And you have this preservation of the institution over the person. And frankly, the Western obsession with size and numbers sometimes just makes individual spiritual formation, next to impossible. As a result of that, there's some carnage. And it's not only for church leaders, but that's the area in which you live. Whether they have succumbed to pressure and temptation and have sort of opted out because of moral failure or because of whatever, narcissistic pastors who kick people out who don't agree with them, or the institution itself is treating people more as numbers than individuals. Either way, it raises some very critical questions, some of which we've discussed. The size of the body matters to our spiritual formation. That's one question that we've wrestled with. What we're doing with those groups, that's a question that we've wrestled with. And at the same time, going forward, if persecution or suffering or trial is a requirement for our spiritual formation, how do we embrace that versus resist it? And your story, how you've wrapped up your story, to me is really emblematic of that last point, which is you and Mary Lee said, we can resist it or we can embrace it. And through embracing it, not only have you guys grown together and grown to be more like Jesus, but now you're enabling others to do that. It brings us to the last question, which is one of hope. You have a very interesting perch. I love talking to you because you just deal in some of the muck and mire of life that other people just won't go. And you're dealing with folks who are hurt, who are burnout, who are at their wits' end, mainly either because of the church or because of their own behaviors in a church. And, Humpty Dumpty can be put back together again. That's what you're doing. You are rallying the king's horses and king's men and helping restore these lives. That, to me, breeds such a sense of hope and encouragement. The question is, if we want to see that expand, the hope, the restoration, the kingdom perspective, true discipleship, spiritual formation, I still keep going back to the how question. I agree there's no perfect widget, but certainly you've seen, whether it's the pod model or some of the churches that are doing spiritual formation well and walking through persecution, suffering, trial well. So can you just close us out by painting a picture of what that looks like and how might that be embraced more even while we wrestle through the challenges of modern institutions?
I think I've found clarity in the last few years. And there's been a framework that's been helpful for me is getting real clear. And I talk to a lot of pastors in transition about this framework, but it's getting clear on identity, assignment, and calling. And for me, knowing who I am and whose I am is a question of identity. If you asked me 10 years ago, tell me about yourself, I'd say I am a pastor. And what I meant was that's my identity. Even though I did all of the preaching in chapels and Sunday mornings on, Nowin's I'm a child of God talk, right?
Beloved,
I knew that, but I had to actually separate. My wife wrote an incredible blog post on talking about the fourth strand of how ministry, we have the cord of three strands, but ministry's worked itself in. And when you start tugging on that ministry strand and actually trying to extricate it from the rest of the knit piece, it's really painful, especially when you've made it your identity. I've had to get real clear on that. I would probably have also put me being a pastor in the category of that being my calling, that this is what I was put on earth to do. And so I would say I am a pastor, and I meant that was my identity and my calling. And the realization for me now, being on the other side, is that I think it's really my assignment. I've gotten much more clarity, though I don't live in it every single day, but I live with the reality of knowing whose I am, and still trying to live into that. My assignment has become much more clear because that's the vehicle that makes me money to be able to pay the bills. But my calling is something different altogether. And I think that you can have different callings over the course of your life. They say the average male has 11 and a half different assignments, jobs over the course of his life. Average female's 10 and a half, because she's probably having a baby at some point during there. But my calling can change a couple of times. Noah, go build the ark. Abraham, go to this land. And I found that in this season that my calling, and I've talked to you about this, but this story is poignant for me. I call it the man in the hole, and it's the story of this man who's stuck in a dark, deep hole, and he can't get himself out, and he's yelling and screaming for help. And all day long, there are people that are walking by this hole, and they hear the man yelling and screaming for help. They don't know what to do, so they just keep walking. Until one day, there's a guy who comes along, hears the man in the hole yelling and screaming for help, and he does the unthinkable, and he jumps into the hole with the man. And the guy who is stuck in the hole looks at the guy who jumped into the hole and says, "What did you do that for? Now we're both stuck here." And the guy who jumped in said, "I've been in this hole before, and I know how to get out." And I realized when I heard that story that was my calling, especially in this season. And I think that if we could look at our role here, while we're here on earth, is that we're just one beggar showing another beggar where to find bread. That we're going to jump in the hole with people who are in the hole, and we're going to show empathy to them and sit with them in the hole and say, this is hard, but we're also going to love them too much to leave them in the hole, and we're going to help them get out. And that's transformation. And I think that there's a lot of aspects of this that if we could take on that mindset of I have the capacity to sit with you in the mess of your life and show empathy, but I also, I think this is how God works, is that he loves us right where we're at. And he also loves us too much to leave us where we're at. That's the transformation story. I just don't know how many people are being transformed on the Sunday morning message. I think the transformation is happening when it's life on life in these smaller groups. And we have people that are going to say, I see you, right? That megachurch pastor does not know what's going on in your everyday life. It'd be too much pain for one person, right? Like church consultants, they would say that you could really only have one pastor for every 150 people. I think that's still a lot, right? But it'd be too much for one person, one pastor at a megachurch to take on all of the pain and what's going on in every single person. It's an unfair request. And so I do believe that if we can grow small, if we can have that intimacy built, and then we can say, I'm going to be with you here, and I'm also going to be with you along the journey. And it's one of the things that we do with pastoral transitions is I'm not guaranteeing at the end of 6 months that you're going to be wholly formed and everything's going to be great. I feel like it's taken me 5 years myself, and I still have days where I'm like, man, what am I doing with my life? But I can say that while I can't guarantee the outcome, I can guarantee you that I'm going to walk with you in this. And really, like, that relationship between you and Jesus is your relationship between you and Jesus. And I just want to be an observer. I want to be somebody who walks alongside you in that. I think if we could do more of that, if that becomes more of the message, if pastors realize that that's what we're supposed to do, that's our calling, I think that there is a health. And if I've said anything that gives you the sense that I'm down on the church and I've lost hope for the church, I actually have a very strong ecclesiology. And I have to, because we know in the end that the bride will be radiant. And it says, I love in Revelation 22, it says, they will see his face. And his face, the face of the groom, is not one of disappointment. I've officiated a lot of weddings, and I've always looked at the face of the groom, and it's never been, what's up with her, right? Like a little bit too much makeup. What's going on? And it's always like delight. And so I know the face of the groom when he sees the bride in the end is not maybe how my face or your face at times is looking at the bride. I have hope.
It's powerful. It's awesome. Thanks for sharing that. If folks want to get in touch with you, what's the best way that they can do that?
Well, of my 18 emails, probably the one that's most appropriate for this one, you can get me at Matt, M-A-T-T, at pastoraltransitions.com. And
you have a great podcast associated with that, so why don't you share that?
Yeah. we figured people don't want to listen to something called Pastoral Transitions, but we took a different spin on it, and basically have said we're really interested in what it takes to rebuild life after ministry. And so my wife and I, we get to host this together, which is great. Actually, one of the few times that we've actually done ministry together is doing this podcast. And so Life After Ministry is the podcast, and we're about to start our next season on that, but there's no shortage. I have so many stories. I probably have 15 episodes in the hopper that are waiting to be released, but we're not there to throw rocks at the church. What we're trying to do is say, if your last day in vocational ministry, we call that day 0, what did you do on day 1 to begin rebuilding your life in the areas of career coaching and counseling? And so a lot of people that are coming to us who've lost hope and trying to figure out what's next, I can just say, hey, I've got 30 examples here, stories, and it's an ever-growing library of hope. And I want you to listen and lean in. And that's been fruitful, and it's amazing. Like, for a small podcast, like, and analytics and all that, like, we've had 40,000 plus people listen in like the first 6 months, and which shocked us because we have we are the niche of the niche of the niche, right? Like, this doesn't get much smaller slice of the pie than what we're doing, but it tells us that there's a lot of people that are hurting and listening. And so it's redemptive. It's all redemptive. Jesus is redeeming it all.
Awesome. Matt, thanks so much for spending so much time with us today. I appreciate it.
Yep. Thanks for having me.
And thanks to you for listening or watching or reading. If you want more information on Soil and Roots, you can check us out at soilandroots.org. We are all over the obligatory social media. You can find us on Facebook and Instagram at Soil and Roots Podcast. You can find us on Substack and YouTube at just Soil and Roots. Thanks so much for being with us today, and we'll see you next time.